Finally, therefore, it is our firm conclusion that because of this sudden tilt in the Earth's surface, at the precise time of Flight 901's approach, Mount Erebus rose into the air and collided with the DC-10. We trust that you will give our conclusions due weight in your deliberations. Yours sincerely, the Flat Earth Society.
We must reply, thanking the Society for its contribution to what is, for all of us, an extremely complex question.
It is September 1980.
Scotland.
The Erebus Commission enters its third month. The dynamics of the hearings are about to change. It's the Pilots Association's turn to call its witnesses to give evidence, and the line pilots must prove under oath the allegations Council have been putting to Air New Zealand witnesses.
Morning, Liz. I'm just trying to warn you. Till now, Air New Zealand's been putting them up and we've been shooting them down on the basis of what the pilots would say. But they've got jobs and families.
Captain Leslie Simpson and his crew attended the same briefing as Collins.
The briefing officer, Captain Wilson, referred to many matters in the course of his briefing that I do not recall. Captain Wilson said he mentioned to us that the track would come from Cape Hallett over Erebus to McMurdo. I have absolutely no recollection of him saying this. My understanding was that the track proceeded to a position in McMurdo Sound.
Simpson goes on to detail his phone call to Ross Johnson, which set off a chain reaction in Air New Zealand's flight operations, leading to a change in the McMurdo destination waypoint. The contents of that phone call are hotly disputed.
I did not report this matter to Captain Johnson as an error in position, as I had no reason to believe the 164.48 position at the bottom of McMurdo Sound was other than the logical point to terminate the flight plan track. Captain Johnson is not correct when he states that I rang him and told him that the McMurdo position was in error and should be 166 degrees 58 minutes. Captain Johnson's recollection is also incorrect on the matter of my mentioning the cross-track distance. I certainly did mention to him that the cross-track distance to the nearest ground navigational aid was approximately 27 miles to ensure that subsequent crews were not unnecessarily surprised at the distance.
Thank you, Captain Simpson. Would you answer any questions?
Captain Simpson, my instructions enable me to say to you that so far as my client company is concerned, your integrity and veracity are beyond any question. For your part, do you accept a similar position so far as Captains Ross Johnson and John Wilson are concerned?
Yes.
Does it matter what he thinks? It's what I think.
You would accept, no doubt, that there are areas where your recollection diverges from that of Captains Johnson and Wilson?
Yes.
Would you also accept that they and you could be at fault in certain areas of personal recollection?
I make no claim to having an impeccable memory. I heard and saw the briefing once. Captain Wilson's evidence in general I have no great conflict with. It's just the extreme fine detail that he appears to have included for the commission that I don't recall. In Captain Johnson's case, however, the description I heard in this court was so different to my recollection of that briefing that I wondered if, in fact, I'd attended the same briefing.
Captains Johnson and Wilson would almost inevitably have had some regard to the notes from which they used to work.
Yes, I would expect so.
Whereas what you carried away was a general impression.
Yes, but I was asked to recall my flight and the briefings at an interview with Mr. Chippendale and Captain Gemmell only 1 month after I made the flight. As well as giving Captain Eden a copy of that interview, I kept one for my own record, so I do have that available for reference.
This interview 1 month after your flight, you say, included, as a member of the group, Mr. Gemmell?
Yes, sir.
Am I to take it then that your explanation as to how you came to report the coordinates position was given at that meeting?
Yes, that's correct.
Therefore, the airline has known from mid-December of last year, about 15 days after the disaster, your exact position on that matter.
Yes, sir.
As a puzzle for you, Gary, that Air New Zealand have known the nature of Simpson's evidence for so long, yet have maintained implacably their position that the official route was always over Erebus and that the minimum prescribed altitude was 6,000 feet.
The tickets, Your Honour. Washington, Florida, then London.
Thank you. Let Mr. Baragwanath know.
Perhaps Simpson's understanding of the briefing was just peculiar to him.
And I have absolutely no recollection of Captain Wilson advising us at any stage that our flight track would overfly Mount Erebus. As regards the 6,000 feet height, I considered this to be for the purpose of a cloud break procedure, and that further descent in VMC, visual meteorological conditions, was at the captain's discretion, subject to approval from the local McMurdo air traffic controller.
Simpson and Gabriel's understanding of their briefing is not unique. A succession of line pilots take the stand. They'd been briefed for Antarctic flights at different times over a period of 2 years before the crash.
I do not recall Captain Wilson making any clear statement to the effect that we would overfly Mount Erebus.
And subject to clearance by the local air traffic controller, I considered I was at liberty to descend further so long as VMC conditions could be maintained.
I took from our briefing that the flight track passed to the west of Mount Erebus, and that our approach to the McMurdo area was via the McMurdo Sound. I did not understand from the briefing that we were restricted from descending below 6,000 feet.
But an executive pilot, Captain Maynard Hawkins, flight manager training, testifies to a different understanding of his briefing.
I have a clear recollection that we did not descend below 6,000 feet, which in my mind was clearly the company's minimum permissible altitude. I'm aware that a newspaper article has been produced at this commission, which states that my flight descended to approximately 700 feet above the ice shelf. This is definitely not correct.
Are you saying that such a statement was factually incorrect because the aircraft was never anything like that low?
The statement is totally incorrect.
We've received information from a passenger on your flight, and he understood that the aircraft descended to approximately 1,000 feet. Was that information also quite incorrect?
That would be totally incorrect.
Mr. McAllister.
Captain Vetty attended the same briefing as you attended.
Correct.
And Captain Vetty is a flight instructor, DC-10s.
Correct.
And are you aware that Captain Vetty descended to 1,500 feet whilst over McMurdo?
Yes, I am now aware of that fact.
So we're left with two alternatives. Either Captain Vetty interpreted the briefing instructions differently from you, or he deliberately disobeyed those instructions. Are you suggesting that Captain Vetty deliberately disobeyed them?
No, I'm not suggesting that at all.
In fact, many senior captains in Air New Zealand have interpreted the instructions differently from you, haven't they?
Yes, it would appear so.
I put it to you that if instructions are ambiguous, then they are deficient, aren't they?
In hindsight, yes.
Silence. Stand up, please.
The pilots know damn well that Collins should have checked the coordinates when he entered them in the plane's computer. He should have plotted them on a topographical map before he got to the Antarctic. He shouldn't have descended below 16,000 feet until he'd got an independent fix. And if they were expecting the track to take them down the Sound, they should have noticed that Beaufort Island was on their right instead of on their left.
Please, Ian, it's late.
The point is, they're walking all over us. If Collins didn't know where he was, why didn't he know where he was?
The coordinates.
The coordinates. I'm sick to death of hearing about them. Coordinates. He should have plotted them. He's the pilot in command. He's got to know where he is. So one important question.
Air New Zealand changes tack and makes 12 separate allegations of pilot error. Their common element is the proposition that Collins should not have been misled by the mistaken coordinates. If he did not know where he was, that was his fault, not the company's.
I readily agree that had the extent of the change to the McMurdo coordinates been known within the company prior to the accident, then the changes should have been reported to Captain Collins prior to takeoff. However, I don't believe that the failure to do so justifies Collins's omission to check that the coordinates he received at the briefing were the same as those contained in the actual flight plan of the day.
But Gemmel's view is strongly opposed by the line pilots.
Now, did you receive another flight plan on the day of your flight?
Yes, I did.
Did you have any reason to believe that it would be in any way different from the flight plan that was handed to you at the briefing?
No, I did not.
You felt entitled to rely on the information given at the briefing as being the same as on the day of your flight?
Yes, I did. At all previous briefings I've been to, there has usually been a copy of the relevant flight plan. And when I subsequently come to fly the particular route, the flight plan has always been identical to that given at the briefing.
If any coordinates have been changed between the time you received the flight plan at the briefing and the day of your flight, would you expect that information to be passed on to you?
Yes, I would.
Thank you very much. You told us you plotted the McMurdo coordinates during your flight.
Yes.
If you had plotted the McMurdo waypoint prior to your flight, from information given at the briefing, do you think you would have done it again during your flight?
No. I don't think I would have.
The requirement remains for the pilot to identify his position independently of the onboard AINS navigation equipment. And in the absence of ground-based radio or radar information, that can only be done by positively identifying geographical features visually before descending from minimum safe altitude. It's possible to see how a situation could have developed to the point where the crew eventually ran out of options, in what perhaps may best be described as a conspiracy of circumstances extending back much earlier than the last 30 minutes of the CVR tape. That such a series of events and coincidences should have developed to the point which the evidence before this commission has revealed almost defies belief. And yet they happened. To try and identify the part which any one action or decision played in causing or contributing to the accident is most difficult under such circumstances. However, the pilot in command is the person ultimately responsible for the safety of his aircraft and passengers. The man on the spot, whose decisions and actions decide the fate of all those on board.
The Airline Pilots Association witnesses say, and I think correctly, that Collins would have been entitled to rely on the information given him at his briefing and could have expected to have been notified of any change to the flight plan. But the question still arises as to whether Collins did in fact rely on that flight plan given him at the briefing. Did he plot the false route from that flight plan onto a map or chart? And if so, when did he do that?
You'll be asked to swear on the Bible, to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Don't be frightened. Stand up straight and look only at the person who
was asking the question. And say only what you remember.
Yes. No more, no less. That's what your father would have wanted.
It's all right, Mum. Don't worry.
One of the final clues in Mann's quest as to what was in Collins' mind as he approached Erebus lay with the pilot's widow and his daughters.
What will they ask me?
They'll concentrate on Jim's plotting of the route. They'll try to undermine your credibility, Maria. I can't protect you from that.
What about the girls?
I'm hoping Mann won't make them take the stand.
Now, Elizabeth, in your affidavit, you say that your father was working on the kitchen table with maps the night before the flight. And you came in and looked over his shoulder. Do you recall anything about the maps he was working on?
He had the New Zealand atlas that Nana and Grandad gave him, open on the table. And he had another bigger map.
A bigger map?
When Dad opened it to show me where he was going, it was too big for the kitchen table, so we spread it out on the floor.
And what do you remember about it?
The sea was a green colour, and there were purple colours for the land.
Anything else?
The first thing that caught my eye was the Ross Sea shelf.
Here, show me.
I asked Dad if that was where they were going to land. He said although the shelf was solid ice, that they wouldn't be landing. I remember he ran his finger down the raggedy edge of the Ross Sea and said, "We keep fairly close to this bumpy lot."
Richard, I've got to return to chambers. Keep Mrs. Collins on the stand until I get back. Ask her to recite Bar Bar Black Sheep if you have to, but keep her there.
Morning, Lloyd.
He had a ruler or some measuring equipment and was working on a large chart of the Antarctic Ross Sea region. He indicated the path of the aircraft down the coast of Victoria Land to McMurdo Sound. I remember he mentioned flying over the Dry Valley area, and he indicated the aircraft would fly back from McMurdo Sound up the same coastline on its return flight. Do not recall him making any mention of Mount Erebus. My father was working...
You've done very well, Catherine. Thank you both for coming in, helping us. Gary. Their affidavits will be sufficient, David. They won't have to be called.
My husband would have spent between 1.5 and 2 hours working on these maps and materials at the dining room table. It was a reasonably frequent practice of his to spend time in preparation of his flights, going over briefing materials, etc., particularly in respect of a new route that he hadn't flown before, or a route that he hadn't recently flown. He came back through from the girls' room about 9:30, 9:45, after tucking in Elizabeth and Catherine. I was looking at some publicity brochures as he packed up his maps and instruments. And at one stage, he came up behind me and looked over my shoulder. He was excited at the prospect of going down there. And he said something like, "Awesome, isn't it?" Expecting me to agree. I can remember just shivering and saying, "I can't get enthusiastic over a hunk of ice and snow. I really can't."
But would you be good enough to answer any questions put to you by counsel?
Mr. McLaren?
Nothing, Your Honour.
Mr. Nicholson?
I have no questions.
Mr. McGrain?
No questions, Your Honour.
You may step down, Mrs. Collins.
Mann is now convinced that Collins relied on the false information given him at the briefing and plotted a flight track which he knew would take his DC-10 down McMurdo Sound over the flat sea ice well clear of Erebus.
Now, will 4 be enough, do you think? Peter, you have got to check in at some ungodly hour tomorrow morning. I am trying to get your suitcase packed.
Sorry.
What is the matter?
I woke to find myself in a dark wood, where the right road was wholly lost and gone. Ah me, how hard to speak of it.
Oh dear, has it come to that?
I was as proud as any man could be, as if the mayor had offered me
The commission adjourns, while Mann and assisting counsel David Baragwanath follow a trail which will provide a succession of hammer blows to Chippendale's report. In Washington, D.C., they visit the National Transportation Safety Board's audio laboratory. Colonel Paul Turner had assisted with the original transcription of the cockpit voice recorder. The team of New Zealanders he assisted had been chosen for its knowledge of the crew's voices and its familiarity with DC-10 flight procedure.
Through here, gentlemen.
But Chippendale rejected parts of that transcription and took the CVR tape to England, where he carried out his own transcription at the Farnborough laboratories.
So, did Mr. Chippendale know the voices of the crew?
No, Colonel.
Well, was anyone there with him in England who did know the voices?
Apparently not. One of the changes made by Chippendale particularly interests me because of the strenuous objections made to it by the Airline Pilots Association.
Bit thick here, hey, Bird?
That was seized upon by the media, understandably, as indicating that the aircraft was flying in cloud.
And that would put your pilot at fault?
Precisely. Was that it? Again, please.
So, bit thick here, eh, Bert, becomes what?
Well, I personally would transcribe that as, this is Kate Bird. Was anyone on the flight deck known as Bert?
No. There's something else that puzzles me. We played the whole tape through several times. Chippendale's report from memory said that the 2 engineers on the flight deck had voiced frequent queries and had expressed their mounting alarm. That received enormous publicity. Where is all that?
I think you have to realize, gentlemen, that Mr. Chippendale seems to have made the Farnborough transcriptions with the theory already in mind. Now, that can leave you hearing what you expect to hear.
The following day, Mann and Baragwanath fly to Fort Lauderdale, Florida, for an appointment at the Bendix Corporation, the manufacturers of the DC-10's weather radar. Chippendale had concluded that this equipment would have depicted the mountainous terrain ahead. The crew's failure to monitor the radar and see Erebus had made headlines when his report was released.
When an aircraft enters cloud, it almost always suffers from turbulence.
Okay. Our radar is designed to pick up the presence of cloud ahead at long range. The radio impulses are transmitted from the aircraft, and they pick up the moisture in the cloud. There's no moisture, there's no return on the screen.
What is the moisture content in the ice in Antarctica?
It's almost devoid of moisture. It's considered to be drier than the Sahara Desert. The ice surface of the Ross Sea is totally dry, as is the thick coating of ice on Mount Erebus.
Simple. No return.
That's if the radar was set in the weather mode.
And if it was set in the other mode, the mapping mode?
You would get some sort of blurred return from the ice.
So they would have seen the mountain, albeit in blurred form?
No. They'd be getting the same return off the mountain ice as they were getting off the sea ice.
Surely there must be a difference between the return of flat sea ice and the return of the ice on the slopes of Erebus.
Not necessarily. The mountain itself would give off what we call shadow effect behind the blurred ice return, but it would be distorted and unclear.
You would have to know precisely what you were looking for.
You'd have to know the mountain was there.
If, hypothetically, the pilot thought he was flying over the flat sea ice of McMurdo Sound, would the return have tended to confirm that?
If that's where he believed he was, yes.
The assertion by the chief inspector that the DC-10's radar would have depicted the mountain had featured prominently in the New Zealand and international press. The immediate reaction of the public had been that the aircraft crew had failed to look at the radar screen when flying in impaired visibility and had failed to see the clear and unmistakable outline of the mountain right in front of them. For Mann, that has now been proved a fallacy. Under his terms of reference, Mann is also required to consider whether there have been any act or omission by McMurdo Air Traffic Control which contributed to the disaster. There had been evidence which suggested the DC-10 might well have appeared on U.S. Navy radar at McMurdo, but the chief air traffic controller on the day of the disaster disagrees.
I believe the DC-10 was not identified on our radar screen, sir.
Can we take this in steps, Warrant Officer? The flight recorder confirms that the aircraft's transponder was activated at this point, G. Would the radar operator not have been able to say at that point that the aircraft was just to the geographical northeast of Mount Bird and warn the pilot?
If he saw the blip on the radar screen. But he did not, sir.
Mann asks to speak to the radar operator and the VHF radio operator. But Lieutenant Commander Fessler, the U.S. Navy attorney, springs a surprise.
I understood they were available.
They are not.
May I ask why?
My orders are simply that they are not available for questioning here at this time.
Then might I question them elsewhere at another time?
I'm afraid not.
May I speak with your superior?
It is my decision.
Then you'll be able to give me an answer to my earlier query as to the reason for that unavailability.
I am sorry, sir.
Very well, Lieutenant Commander. I have another request. I wish to visit the McMurdo installation.
In the Antarctic?
It's still there, I take it.
Yes, you may go there.
Thank you.
But only if you give me your unconditional guarantee that you will question no one down there, and I mean no one. If you want to ask questions, I have got to accompany you.
I'm given to understand there is a Navy attorney down there all the time. Surely there's no need.
Those are the conditions, sir.
Well, this was clearly your decision, Lieutenant Commander. Good day.
Sir, I need your guarantee.
I shall let you know. All in good time.
While the U.S. Navy seems intent to balk Mann, Lloyd's of London, who act for Air New Zealand's insurance syndicate, seem just as anxious to talk. Mann is asked to meet Peter Martin, Lloyd's solicitor.
I thought since you were both in London, it was an ideal opportunity for a chat. A chance for an informal discussion on how things are going down there.
Thank you.
Off the record, of course.
I'm afraid that isn't possible, Mr. Martin. Any discussion involving the inquiry can't be off the record. As Royal Commissioner, His Honour is obliged under his warrant.
Very well. Very well. As you are aware, gentlemen, I receive daily transcripts of evidence from New Zealand. And These, as I'm sure you're also aware, have been very carefully studied, not just by me. It's fair to say that both I and my clients, that is the insurance syndicate, are becoming somewhat perturbed at the nature of evidence being produced by Air New Zealand.
Mr. Martin, I can tell you what I told Air New Zealand Council, that I do have severe reservations about the credibility of Air New Zealand's altitude and navigational evidence, but that I have as yet reached no conclusions.
Yes, yes. Nevertheless, it is likely that you will be compelled to make adverse findings against Air New Zealand as to the credibility of their evidence. Look, I want to make it quite clear that Lloyd's has played no part in concocting these false explanations.
For Mann, the jigsaw puzzle is almost complete. On the first anniversary of the disaster, he flies south to the Antarctic. It matters little that Lieutenant Commander Fessler has ensured a hostile reception by the U.S. Navy at McMurdo Base, because Mann experiences for himself the whiteout phenomenon, and the last piece of the puzzle falls into place. Mann will fly home with a graphic picture of the moods of nature dominating the last place on Earth. After 4 months of hearings and over 50 witnesses, a film recovered from a passenger's camera at the crash site is screened for the commission. It is a potent reminder of why they're all there.
What angle is he taking on this, Lloyd?
Difficult to say precisely, Des. Difficult to know what Mann's line of thinking is. Baragana's questions seem to be consistently pointing towards some sort of general administrational malaise.
What? David?
There has been the odd difficulty, much of it, of course, caused by the Pilots Association keeping evidence like Exhibit 164 up its sleeve.
The bums. I mean, what the devil are they trying to do to us?
Mr. Davis, the atmosphere in that room between Air New Zealand and the pilots has not been a pretty thing to behold. It's verged on open hostility.
Yes, but why?
There seems to be a feeling amongst them that Air New Zealand wants a finding of pilot error.
Rubbish. We have avoided speculation at all times. We've always wanted an open inquiry. Quite, Maury.
Mr. David, you're shortly going to have to give evidence yourself.
Yes?
And there may be areas which will cause you some difficulty. We should prepare carefully.
I don't want to look at Turkey up there.
When you made the decision to shred the documents, was that of your own initiative or on instructions?
Mr. Watson, the chairman of our committee, and I together made the decision that surplus documents would be destroyed. I took the decision to have them shredded.
Was that matter discussed with Mr. Davis?
Mr. Davis was in the office on one occasion when we were discussing the disposal of documents.
No further questions, Your Honour.
Thank you, Mr. Oldfield. You may step down.
I call Morris and Richie Davis.
As Mann watches the chief executive come forward and take the stand, he is reflecting on all that he's seen and heard about the man. In particular, his loyalty and tenacity in defense of his company.
The truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
I do. During my 35 years with the airline, I have seen it develop from somewhat humble beginnings down at Mechanics Bay, operating flying boats across the Tasman, progressively re-equipping through to our present DC-10s. Despite the problems which arose in operating aircraft during those early pioneering years,
Mann realizes he's listening to the story of an archetypal self-made man, and he begins to understand Davis's close identification with the company, and why Davis has risen to any attack on Air New Zealand as if it were an attack on his own flesh and blood.
the company's policy was and is to place before the Commission all material relevant to its terms of reference, irrespective of whether such evidence was favourable to the airline or not. Instructions were given to Council accordingly. My attitude from the very outset was that all facts must be ascertained and revealed.
Do you recall being aware from any source that some copies of documents were being put through the shredder at head office?
We insisted at the outset of the in-house investigation that all relevant documents should be placed in a specific file, and that any extraneous matter, like duplicates, should in fact be put aside. But no document in itself was destroyed.
I don't think you've told us why you thought it was necessary to issue order for destruction in the first place.
The security circumstances of the company affairs, not only in Air New Zealand, but generally throughout the country at this time, is that people seek to make a name for themselves by passing the relevant documents, and sometimes immaterial, but also provocative documents, to the media. Having experienced this, I recognised that it could in fact be distressing to all concerned. Matters taken out of context. Considerations given that were erroneous. I required one single file, unadulterated and authenticated.
The fact that there had been an error of 2 degrees in the coordinates was never a matter publicly acknowledged by the company.
You're referring to a public statement?
Yes.
I'm the prime individual involved in making the statements. I confine my remarks to the facts when questioned whether there was a fault in the computer or in the accident flight. My reply was that there was not.
Was it ever publicly acknowledged that there had been a change of 2 degrees made before the night of the flight?
Not by me.
Was it ever made by any other person in the company, to your knowledge?
As far as I'm aware, no. I can't account for some people in the organisation who may have sought some allegiance with the press by passing out information that was confidential.
Was the decision not to disclose the 2 degree change in coordinates a deliberate decision made by you as chief executive?
It was my decision to confine my remarks about the coordinates to the information contained within the navigational equipment of the accident flight.
And you feel that you made a fair disclosure to the public, given the questions asked of you?
Yes. I should explain that at the time the information came to me that there had been a previous error that had been added to the computer. Taken out of context, it could assume an importance that otherwise was not due to it. Now, whether that is as valid now as it was then is open to conjecture.
Did you not consider it more prudent to take the initiative and disclose the matter in its correct context?
I didn't feel the need to explain myself to the press, no.
We're talking about the public, not the press.
The media whereby the public are kept informed. I didn't see, under the circumstances at the time, that I was under any significant obligation to make disclosures to the press or to the public via the press.
Mr. McElhenney. Exhibit 84, Your Honour. An article by Mr. John Brizendine in the Travelling Times. Mr. Brizendine's flight to the Antarctic was personally arranged by you, was it not?
It was.
And did he not send you a personal note at the conclusion of the flight?
He did.
And did he enclose with it a copy of the article he proposed to have published?
Yes.
And did you reply to him and thank him?
I noted that I'd received his letter, yes.
Did you reply to him and thank him?
I can't recall the contents of the letter in exact terms, no.
But let me get this straight. You did drop him a note saying you had received his letter.
I usually do. I just don't recall whether on this occasion I did in fact write formally to him or not. I'm afraid I can't answer that.
Would you have written and thanked him without reading the proposed article?
Oh, indeed.
And are you sure you didn't read it at all?
I'm as certain as I can be.
He was the chairman of McDonnell Douglas, was he not?
President.
But even in his case, you did not read his memo before replying.
Mr. Brizendine is an old friend of mine. We have talked together, formally and informally, over the years, and write letters from time to time. The fact is, I would not normally spend the time to read an article about a flight in which he had already formally thanked me personally.
Having personally arranged for Mr. Brizendine to take that flight and gone to that trouble, weren't you concerned to see that the company got some favorable publicity?
I didn't invite him for that purpose. Therefore, I would be totally unconcerned whether we got good publicity or not.
Gary. Ask the Department of Justice to put an inquiry agent onto the Brizendine issue of the Travelling Times. I want to know what its distribution was and whether Air New Zealand had a hand in it.
For one reason or another, the minimum altitudes were not adhered to, and this state of affairs persisted over many months. It seems to have been common knowledge so far as the company's internal newspaper is concerned, and the Travelling Times document, together with Air New Zealand personnel who flew on the aircraft, including your own deputy. From where you stand at the top of the executive, is it not a matter of some concern that this state of affairs could have continued, and for so long?
Very much so.
Have you reflected on any basic problems in the company that have contributed to this?
I am convinced, after many discussions and many considerations, that the pilot morale, while everything has its ups and downs, is at a very excellent level. In my opinion, no other reason existed, or does exist at the present time.
I don't want to be misunderstood. I wasn't thinking of morale, but rather basic lack of communication. Obviously, very senior people in the company knew what the aircraft were doing. It was common knowledge amongst those who chose to read the literature, and yet the executive pilot seemed not to have been told, or if they were told, did not do anything about it.
I wish I could answer you in more precise fashion. I do not believe there exists at this time an organization so dedicated to communications within staff levels as does Air New Zealand. The question of the dissemination of this particular information about low flying remains a mystery to me.
It is the broad effect of your evidence, then, that you are content with the company organizational arrangements as they stand.
I am of the opinion the organization situation in the company, in the operational department, that existed at the time of the Antarctic flights was, if operated reasonably, capable of sustained, proper communication in the matters I think you're referring to.
Thank you, Mr. Davis. No further questions. Would you answer any questions put to you by His Honor?
Mr. Davies, were you made aware of the arrangements to distribute throughout New Zealand a copy of Mr. Brizendine's article contained in the Travelling Times?
No.
Evidently, there were 1 million copies printed, and they all referred, of course, to the scenic flight at 3,000 feet. This occurred in 1978.
Yes.
Would that have been done by the commercial division?
As I understand it, the publication you refer to is produced by a subsidiary of Air New Zealand called ANZAC. And they have a strong relationship with several tour operators, and it is a joint effort of the groups involved to produce that magazine.
Well, the only difficulty there is that there is not one executive of your airline who can testify that he heard anything about flight at below 6,000 feet.
Yes.
Yet the airline itself was party to 1 million papers advertising that fact.
Yes.
Can you explain that? Thank you, Mr. Davis. You may step down.
Silence. Stand up, please.
5 months of hearings come to an end. Mann has been forced to ask the government for 3 extensions of time in order to hear over 50 witnesses, read 3,500 pages of evidence, study almost 300 exhibits. With the help of counsel, he's followed a highly technical trail of clues to a disaster in the most remote place on Earth. As Mann looks forward to writing his report for Parliament and the conclusion of a long and demanding inquiry, he cannot know that his own trial is about to begin.
In my opinion, therefore, the single dominant and effective cause of the disaster was the mistake made by those airline officials who programmed the aircraft to fly directly at Mount Erebus and omitted to tell the aircrew. That mistake is directly attributable not so much to the persons who made it, but to the incompetent administrative airline procedures which made the mistake possible. No judicial officer ever wishes to be compelled to say that he has listened to evidence which is false. He always prefers to say, as I hope the hundreds of judgments which I have written will illustrate, that he cannot accept the relevant explanation, or that he prefers a contrary version set out in the evidence. But in this case, the palpably false sections of evidence which I heard could not have been the result of mistake or faulty recollection. They originated, I am compelled to say, in a predetermined plan of deception. They were very clearly part of an attempt to conceal a series of disastrous administrative blunders. And so I am forced, reluctantly, to say that I had to listen to an orchestrated litany of lies.
Man's a bloody bum.
Maria? Mann's report's out. Listen.
In my opinion, neither Captain Collins nor First Officer Casson nor the flight engineers made any error which contributed to the disaster.
They were not responsible for its occurrence. Maria?
Where did he get this stuff from?
I don't quite understand how this could have happened.
Lloyd, did Mann give you any indication that he was thinking along these lines?
None.
David?
We felt that possibly he might have given more weight to some matters like coordinates than Chippendale did, but... You know.
Richard?
It's totally off the wall, sir.
What?
Unexpected, sir.
There are very serious allegations in the report relating to the Chief Executive's integrity. The board totally rejects the Commission's findings.
Will Mr. Davis be resigning?
We have a lot of faith in Mr. Davis, and we want him to stay on.
What about the coordinates?
Thank you.
Is the board going to take any action?
What's the story, Maury?
Were you the conductor, Maury?
Will you be resigning?
My professional competence and integrity have come under savage attack in the Erebus report. That attack is totally indefensible. I reject entirely any allegations that my performance of duties, giving of evidence, or relationship to the giving of evidence by others was in any way inadequate or improper.
What else could he say?
But worse is to follow. The Director of Civil Aviation, Captain Kippenberger, refuses to accept Mann's finding that his division was also culpable. Civil aviation's role in the disaster was reviewed by a State Services Committee.
My officers and I were harshly dealt with by the Commissioner.
1 month later, this committee, comprising a former Chief of Defense Staff and a senior civil servant, absolved civil aviation of any culpability, despite acknowledging what it called significant shortfalls by the division.
It's the civil service absolving the civil service. The government can't just stand by and allow them to do this.
What now, Mr. Attorney General?
The next step would have to be a police investigation of possible criminal actions by employees of Air New Zealand, logically.
Logically? Where is this bloody thing going to end? Eh?
Well, I think we're obliged to put in track.
You wanted a commission of inquiry, then the State Services Commission. Now it's a police investigation. By the time this thing is finished, every man and his dog might as well have had a go at it. How many national flag carriers have we got, Jim? How many companies does this country send out into the world in a high-tech, high-profile industry who can say, we can do it, and better than most?
What's now getting doing here? Where's Jim?
Where's Murray?
Mr. Justice Mann's findings that there has been a litany of lies and, by implication, a cover-up are extravagant. These allegations were not put to those involved nor substantiated by the evidence. These are grave deficiencies, and the board has instructed counsel to seek legal redress and to issue proceedings in the High Court to review and set aside these allegations.
Has Mr. Davis anything to say?
The following day, the chairman of the board, Bill Mace, and his deputy, Des Dalgetty, meet the Prime Minister in his office, after which Muldoon declares his hand.
The future of Air New Zealand is a matter which must concern all New Zealanders. It is an airline of which we have been proud for 40 years, and of which we can still be proud. My own reading of the Mann report tells me that these findings are not supported by any evidence set out in the report.
What?
But merely represent an opinion expressed by Mr. Justice Mann.
It's unprecedented.
The president of the Auckland Law Society, Mr. Ted Thomas, disagreed.
It is accepted that the report of any inquiry is open to criticism. The lawyers are concerned that the opinions of Air New Zealand board member Mr. Des Dalgetty and of the airline's senior counsel, Mr. Lloyd Brown, are being given equal weight to Mr. Justice Mann's conclusions. As an independent jurist, Mr. Justice Mann's credentials are without parallel.
And the opposition spokesman on transport says he's critical of the Prime Minister.
Well, you said at the beginning it was going to be a political football.
I didn't expect this. I was appointed by the Governor-General on the recommendation of the Prime Minister, and the Prime Minister has just abandoned me.
For Mann, the die is cast. There will be an unprecedented review of his findings as Royal Commissioner.
He is subverting the legal process. Should we simply step aside? I'll be circumspect, David. I shall make it clear that it is not a matter of personality.
Muldoon wants a public brawl. He thrives on them.
So, I'm to cower from the little man?
Well, it's not just a question of Muldoon. If you go public, it'll put the judiciary in an awkward position.
How?
You know it's a cardinal sin for a judge to engage in a public debate over his own decision.
But I was acting as a member of the executive, not the judiciary.
With all due respect, sir, that is a legal fiction. You cannot afford to develop a public persona. Already you're guilty in the judge's eyes of using extravagant language.
I have a vocabulary, for God's sake. Am I not to use it?
Some of them consider you could have framed it in such a way so as not to offend.
Offend? They lied to me, and I called them for it. When I became a judge, David, I did not regard it as a vow of retreat from the real world.
Nevertheless, sir, there are rules which...
I will not deny as a judge what I know as a man.
Sir, are you aware of the PM?
Do you mind? Thank you. Good morning, gentlemen and ladies. The Prime Minister's comments are interesting, but unsound. The evidence cannot possibly be understood without reference to thousands of pages of testimony and hundreds of exhibits.
The PM says he hasn't read the evidence, Your Honour, but he says he trusts the opinions of those who have.
Other than myself, obviously. The Prime Minister's confidence in some of his advisers is admirable. I can only suggest that he may find in due course that it has been sadly misplaced.
In May 1981, Air New Zealand grounds 6 executive pilots and transfers another 6 staff to unspecified duties, pending the completion of a police investigation.
Executive pilots including Captains Eden, Grundy, Gemmell, Johnson and Hawkins, Messrs Hewitt, Lawton and Amies from Navigation Section, Briefing Officer Wilson and Flight Dispatch Officer Keeley.
What about Maury Davis?
I have nothing further to add.
I don't understand what's changed. We have complete faith in Maury.
We do. It's not a question of culpability. It's a question of identification. Maury's become identified in the public mind with Erebus.
But we asked him to do that. We asked him to do all the media stuff.
Nevertheless, Bill, it's gone bad on us. I have to think of the company.
We have obligations to the shareholder.
Is there something else we should know, Des?
Well, it's obvious, I would have thought. We have to jettison. Maury understands.
Maury?
It's a hell of a way to go after 40 years. But
it's not resignation, Maury. It's retirement.
I don't give a damn what we call it, Des. Still brands me. It is perhaps unfortunate that some will feel my departure from office is an admission on my part of some kind of failure or guilt. That is decidedly not so. My sole purpose in retiring is an attempt to remove a focus point from this current controversy and hasten the recovery of the company.
For the first time in 40 years, Davis has no job to go to in the morning.
Well, there you are.
He will sit at home for the next 6 weeks, waiting for a knock on the door from the police investigation team. The Commissioner of Police is directed by the Attorney General, Jim Macleay, to investigate possible criminal actions by Air New Zealand personnel before and after the Erebus crash. Superintendent Brian Wilkinson divides the investigation into 4 main areas of possible criminal liability: conspiracy, defeating the course of justice, perjury, manslaughter.
Zed is Davis. He is our ultimate goal. Y is Eden, the Director of Flight Operations. But we work on our way through to them, starting at A.
A is Brian Hewitt, the Chief Navigator.
I was on oath. I answered the questions as honestly as I could. I was responsible, and I said so.
Exhibit 164. That exhibit shows a track down McMurdo Sound right to the coordinates you say were a mistake.
Yes.
And it magically reappears in the pilot's briefing just after you make the mistake?
Yes.
In your evidence, you put that down to coincidence. I'd say better than that. It was a remarkable coincidence.
It wasn't a coincidence. I shouldn't have said that it was. But it seems incredible to me that it should be used as a briefing document when it doesn't follow the correct route. absolutely incredible. The whole thing is just amazing.
Hewitt's direct superior, Ross Johnson, is next.
Captain Simpson, in his evidence, says the briefing you told the Commission you gave Collins and him and the briefing you actually gave him are completely different.
Yes.
Well, does that make you a liar, or would you call it intentional embroidery?
I still think that what I said was correct.
Which would make Simpson's testimony incorrect.
Might have been mistaken. Or he might have been.
Well, that certainly clears that up.
Wilkinson concludes that the true extent of the change in 901's flight track was ignored because of Johnson's failure to notice the discrepancy between Simpson's 27-mile and Hewitt's 2.1-mile cross-track distance.
What do you think?
If you agree with Mann that the coordinates mistake was the dominant cause...
I do. I can't say Collins was absolutely blameless, but I can say any negligence by him was on a minor scale.
Then Hewitt and Johnson have to be charged with manslaughter.
Put it in writing.
Yes, sir. Yes, of course I'll tell him. Peter? Peter?
Do you see him?
Who?
The Dewey's back.
Oh, where?
He's gone. He gave him a start.
Oh, yeah, take your fan there. David Baragwanath was on the phone.
The Court of Appeals agreed to review me.
Now, how did you know that?
My brethren have all gone quiet. Not many of them are talking to me.
Peter, what on earth is going on?
I spoke out against the little corporal. He's been attacking the judiciary for years. I thought they'd be pleased. They shocked poor chaps. Ah, Lloyd Brown. I wrote to Lloyd suggesting we resumed our lunches. Placed the odd bet before the TAB's profits suffered irreparably. I do not consider that my being seen with you in public will be consistent with my representing my client company's best interests, which I continue to do. He might have rung.
It's a good report, Peter.
Thank you, sir.
Set out a solid case for jointly charging Hewitt and Johnson with manslaughter. And I agree with you, in principle.
In principle?
Listen to this. Mann report. That mistake, that's the coordinates mistake, is directly attributable not so much to the persons who made it, but to the incompetent administrative airline procedures which made the mistake possible. I think he's just saved Johnson and Hewitt from manslaughter.
I don't understand why 257 people should die and those two get off scot-free.
The law says we cannot charge a company with manslaughter. If we can't charge a company, why should Johnson and Hewitt be made scapegoats?
Johnson will retain his position with Air New Zealand and go on to become Flight Supervisor of Training on 767s. Hewitt will never regain his job and will never again work as a navigator. Meanwhile, Detective Senior Sergeant Stan Keith is pursuing the question of perjury, central to the orchestrated litany of lies finding in Mann's report.
Captain Eden, in your evidence before the Commission, you admitted to knowing about the change of coordinates on the 29th of November, the day after the crash. Now you say you didn't know until the 4th of December?
Well, I couldn't recall the exact date, and I still can't.
Well, why at the Commission did you say the 29th?
No, I didn't. I said it was Tuesday.
You were asked when you were told, and you answered. It may have been that morning, the morning after.
Well, I thought about it, and I believe it wasn't until the next week.
Ames, Lawton, Hewitt and Johnson all knew the next morning.
Well, I didn't. I assume that navigation section didn't realise the importance. I assume that Captain Johnson may have.
I don't accept that. They fully realised from the night of the 28th. They got Hewitt out of bed twice. They rang him about a 2-degree, 10-minute error. Oh, no, they knew the night before. I'm more inclined to accept your evidence before the Commission.
I don't believe I was told until the following Tuesday. You see, I would have told Mr. Davis as soon as I knew.
Was there an agreement between you and Davis to suppress information regarding the coordinates?
Not as far as I was concerned. You see, I went on leave on the 15th of December, so there was no agreement as far as I was aware.
Certainly a desire to see that it didn't get out into the newspapers.
The committee was told on the 11th, so there was no deliberate attempt to suppress.
On the afternoon of the 5th of December, you called a briefing of the CVR transcribing team, Wyatt, Cooper and Olive, prior to their departure with the CVR tapes for America. Why did you not inform them of the change of coordinates?
I don't think I was there.
You were. If you had told them, would not this have assisted them in transcribing the tape?
I don't know the answer to that at all.
Why didn't you inform the CVR team of the change of coordinates?
I didn't know they didn't know.
I can't reconcile how you could let them go to the States without that knowledge.
Seems extraordinary to you, but not to us.
Eden will retain his position at Air New Zealand as Director of Flight Operations.
Look at it. That's the oldest, stalest trail I've ever clapped eyes on.
I'm sure Eden knew on the 29th of November, the day after the crash.
I agree. That 4th of December story just doesn't hold up.
The question is, when did it get to Davis?
Practically all flight ops and most of Davis's executives know about the change of the coordinates the morning after the crash. Eden says he didn't tell Davis till 5 days later.
Well, I'll tell you what. If any of you withheld that sort of information from me, you wouldn't be working for me much longer.
What about the knowledge of low flying?
Brissenden writes an article in Travelling Times about flying to 3,000 feet. That article is reprinted in Air New Zealand News and is delivered to Davis's desk.
What say he says he was off sick?
The Travelling Times version was delivered to his letterbox at his house.
So, we have here a situation in which Davis, as chief executive, seems not to know something about his own airline that every other person in New Zealand knows.
Do we go and see Davis?
It's perjury. We need corroboration. We can't go and see Davis until we've got something to pin his ears back with. Otherwise, it's just a waste of time.
In the news tonight, the police team investigating the Erebus irregularities draws a blank. Air New Zealand today announced the reinstatement of the 12 employees suspended during the police investigation into the alleged criminal wrongdoings thrown up by the Mann report. The police officer in charge of the investigation, Superintendent Brian Wilkinson, said that no charges would be instituted.
The police investigation concludes that a strong inference can be drawn that senior executives were aware of the low flying being undertaken by their pilots in the Antarctic, but that sufficient corroborative evidence to substantiate charges of perjury cannot be gathered. There are similar difficulties in corroborating any perjury with regard to the knowledge of the change of coordinates. Six months after Mann's report is released, the Court of Appeal review is imminent. Under court order, Mann is able to obtain further documents from Air New Zealand. Among these are minutes of Air New Zealand's board meetings after the crash. They are a revelation.
Davis told the board on the 5th of December that the DC-10 was off track considerably.
Then later he says it appeared to be left of centre.
Which means even he understood the track to be down the Sound. We could have roasted him. Why did you tell your directors that the impact position was off track?
Is it not a fact that, official or not, the accepted flight path was down McMurdo Sound?
And that all pilots in 1978 and 1979 were briefed to fly down the Sound? How do you account for your executive pilots having told the Commission that the official and only flight path was over Mount Erebus? Damn, damn, damn.
You'll have to watch the attraction of alliteration, Gary. Seems to have done me no good. We consistently asked Air New Zealand for all files and records and got truckloads of rubbish. Why were these minutes not produced to us during the commission?
The Air New Zealand Company Secretary said he was given to understand our order for discovery included only documents up to the date of the crash.
And I wonder who would have given him to understand that. Words fail me.
Later in the minutes of the 5th of December board meeting, Davis assures the board that all the navigation systems were functional. He didn't tell them that an error had lain in the computer for 14 months and had only been corrected the night before.
And that Collins hadn't been told about it. In his evidence, Eden said that he knew about the 2-degree error in coordinates on the 29th. Davis surely must have known about them by the 5th of December.
The bitter irony for Mann is that because the minutes were not produced in evidence before him at the Commission, he cannot use them or rely on them in any way in the Court of Appeal. For the appeal hearings in Wellington, Mann chooses an old friend, George Barton, to be his counsel.
Air New Zealand will attack me, George, under the rules of natural justice.
They've got a nerve. Your decisions have helped define the principles of natural justice here.
The ironies burgeon the longer this blessed thing goes on.
What do you want me to do?
I have decided not to attend the hearing, George. Oh? I have no stomach for watching my brethren shift from cheek to cheek and pronounce judgment upon me. I want you to be my eyes and ears in there.
Very well. Where can I reach you?
There's a beautiful forest, George, quite unlike Dante's. There I shall wander, hither and yon, observing the rules of natural justice.
In the Court of Appeal, there is a preliminary battle which foreshadows the final decision. The president is Sir Owen Woodhouse.
Mr. Brown, you had a submission.
Yes, sir, there is one preliminary matter. My learned colleagues, Mr. Baragwanath and Mr. Harrison, do not appear to be representing any party to the inquiry. I submit that they have no status to appear in these proceedings.
Oh, Mr. Baragwanath, what have you to say in answer to Mr. Brown?
Your Honor, we are representing the Attorney General.
Yes, but why?
The public interest must be represented, sir.
And what is the public interest, Mr. Baragwanath?
That the court be fully informed, sir. Your Honor, it is surely necessary that someone in these proceedings is able to put a contrary view to that of Air New Zealand.
You do not then intend to adopt a neutral role?
No, sir.
And what have you to say in answer to that, Mr. Brown?
Your Honor, I'm simply afraid that the Attorney General's role in these proceedings will become confused with Mr. Justice Mann's. And I fail to see how that confusion benefits the public interest.
Delay it.
Neither do I.
Get the Solicitor General down here.
Lloyd! What can I do for you, George?
For heaven's sake, Lloyd, what are you trying on with Woodhouse? Do you really want the whole game to yourselves?
My dear George, it's merely a small preliminary legal joust.
Oh, rubbish. The rest of us are in no position to provide you with real opposition. If Baggs and Harrison get thrown out, it won't be a joust. It'll be a walkover.
Where's your client, George? Now, there's a man fond of the joust, I would have thought. Or at least of white chargers.
Let's keep the personal out of it.
Yes, let's. He's savage, my client company, George. What would you suggest I do?
Represent your client company to the best of your ability, Lloyd, and allow the other view to be put. That's the nature of our system of justice, surely.
Yes, well, let's see what their honours have to say, shall we?
It is not until the Solicitor General intervenes that the Court of Appeal accepts the presence of Baragwanath and Harrison.
Thank you, Mr. Nazar. Very well, Mr. Baragwanath, you may stay.
Such a small country, Sam. Yet there can be no grander perspective than this in all the world. We're quite remote, aren't we? Here, from the agencies of man and state.
Well, you're not alone, Dad. As far as the public is concerned, you're a hero.
I've always been a discreet man of the establishment, Sam. Unlike yourself.
Now you're a man of the people.
In the eyes of the establishment, that simply confirms my decline.
Then fight them, Dad.
Go down with 6 guns blazing. I never really thought it was that kind of country.
Good evening. The Court of Appeal has this evening released its judgment on the review of Mr. Justice Mann's report on the Erebus disaster. The majority decision was that in making allegations of a predetermined plan of deception and of an orchestrated litany of lies against Air New Zealand management, Mr. Justice Mann had exceeded his jurisdiction as Royal Commissioner. The Court of Appeal said that although a Royal Commissioner was permitted to comment on the credibility of witnesses, he wasn't empowered to make what amounted to allegations of criminal conduct against them. The court went on to say that even if Mr. Justice Mann did have the power to make such allegations, he was obliged by the rules of natural justice to put such allegations plainly to the witnesses affected. The court found that Mr. Justice Mann had not done so and quashed the Commission's order for costs against the airline. The Court of Appeal stressed that its decision doesn't in any way affect the Commissioner's findings as to the causes of the disaster.
Rubbish. The manner in which Mr. Justice Mann conducted his inquiry has been damned forever by the Court of Appeal. Mann's report should now attract the contempt of all fair-minded people. One would hope his irresponsible rhetoric will haunt him for the rest of his life. His unfounded and unfair findings against me personally lead me to comment that perhaps the only honourable course left to him is to resign.
You're overreacting, Peter. The Court of Appeal judgment criticises a dozen paragraphs out of 400 in your report. It doesn't upset in any way your findings as to the cause of the disaster.
I'm not talking about the majority decision. I'm talking about Woodhouse and McMullen. They go to great lengths to say I had no evidence for some of the findings that I made. It's unprecedented, George.
But it's only Woodhouse and McMullen who say that. 2 judges out of 5.
There couldn't be a more stringent criticism of a judge. No judge in the history of this country has been placed in this position.
But it's a minority decision, Peter. It has no formal standing.
George, it is a public pronouncement by 2 of my peers that I, as a judge, am unable to determine whether what I am told is truth or lies. And I should answer them publicly. I have offered to resign in protest at the minority decision of the Court of Appeal. The effect of that judgment is simply to reflect the thinking of the management of Air New Zealand.
I think it's a great pity that Mr. Justice Mann has spoken out in public on this issue. You never see a judge of the High Court getting into a public argument over the fact that the Court of Appeal has overturned one of his judgments.
The Prime Minister is completely confused about the situation. My report was not a High Court judgment. A Royal Commissioner can be anyone, any person at all, not necessarily a High Court judge. In the Court of Appeal case, I was an ordinary litigant. I had the right of every litigant to disagree. with the court's decision.
Mr. Justice Mann should put up or shut up. Specifically, he should say who orchestrated the lies and who told the lies, and give his evidence to support both contentions.
I will be only too willing to meet Mr. Muldoon's challenge if he would reconvene the commission.
Now, what he appears to be saying is that he will name names, provided that if he defames someone, he's not held responsible.
Next on Q Talk.
A bombshell has burst on the Mount Erebus Court of Appeal decision. It's been revealed today that 2 judges responsible for the minority decision of the Court of Appeal have family ties with Air New Zealand. The president of the Court of Appeal, Sir Owen Woodhouse, has a daughter who is a public relations officer for Air New Zealand. It's also reported that Mr. Justice McMullen's son is a pilot for Air New Zealand. It was further alleged that Richard McGrain, junior counsel for Air New Zealand, is a close friend of the McMullen family and visited the McMullen home on occasions during the commission hearings.
In the tight, insular circle of the Auckland judiciary, none of this is news to Mann. But the public exposure of the judges he holds responsible for his resignation comes too late. Mann is already committed, on a matter of principle, to a course which will finish his judicial career.
As Attorney General, you shall appeal to the Privy Council on my behalf on the grounds of the judge's bias.
I want no part in any appeal. If you yourself want to appeal to the Privy Council, that's up to you.
Minister, I haven't the resources to fund an appeal to the Privy Council, and you know it.
The government will fund you, providing we can get your pension sorted out. Strictly speaking, you're not entitled to a pension.
Well, I appreciate that. I thought under the circumstances I'd get at least some of it.
As it happens, the Cabinet is prepared to be generous.
But we can't live on that.
I'd be working as well, of course. There'd be arbitrations.
Peter, you're assuming good health and ability to work.
Don't worry, Mother.
But Margarita's fears are realized. Mann is given to understand there is a position for him at the University of Canterbury. He sells his Auckland home and he and Margarita set up house in Christchurch in anticipation. It never materializes. He applies for a part-time position at Lincoln College, just outside Christchurch. The position goes to someone else. The stress begins to tell. He is weakened by influenza and develops a viral heart condition as he battles with the government over who will represent him in his appeal to the Privy Council.
As Attorney General, I'll be taking a strictly neutral stance in the hearings. The government cannot be seen to be supporting your appeal.
Well, surely the government cannot be seen to be undermining it either. If I cannot have Baragwanath and Harrison, my appeal will be compromised. Air New Zealand and Davis will have Lloyd Brown and Williams, who have the benefit of long-standing involvement with the case. I'm asking for the same benefit.
I'll see what I can do.
The government finally allows Baragwanath to represent Mann. Almost 4 years after the disaster on Erebus, the Privy Council hearings begin. Sir Patrick Neale, a London barrister, appears with Baragwanath for Mann. Robert Alexander and Lloyd Brown for Air New Zealand. Mann himself is unable to attend due to ill health.
We are saying that the conspiracy on low flying started from the time Mr. Chippendale was told by Air New Zealand that there were fixed minimum safe altitudes of 16,000 feet and 6,000 feet, depending on where the aircraft was.
Mr. Mann never put to Mr. Davis that he had organized a cover-up, except possibly some very slight inference in relation to low flying.
When questioned by Mr. Mann, Mr. Davis could suggest no reasonable explanation as to why management was unaware of flights below 6,000 feet, when his company had seen fit to print 1 million copies of an article which established just that fact. My lords, it would be hard to find an issue which was more squarely out on the table than whether Air New Zealand witnesses were telling lies about their knowledge of low flying.
Despite Macleigh's assurances that the government does not want to take sides, counsel for the Attorney General finally declares the government's hand.
With respect, your lordships, the New Zealand Court of Appeal is inevitably better placed than are your lordships to make an assessment of what the reasonable New Zealand reader would make of Mr. Mann's report. And accordingly, the Attorney General submits that the Court of Appeal's assessment should be given very great weight. It would only be appropriate for your lordships to differ from it if you're quite satisfied that it is manifestly wrong.
Their lordships desire to place on record their tribute to the brilliant and painstaking investigative work undertaken by Mr. Justice Mann. But notwithstanding, their lordships' own impression of the report has coincided with that of the Court of Appeal.
Although the Privy Council praised Mann for his findings as to the cause of the disaster, his appeal is dismissed. The Air New Zealand management is cleared of organized perjury, and the Privy Council makes an extraordinary finding in relation to executive knowledge of low flying.
While their lordships accept that there was probative material before the judge from which he is entitled to draw the inference that at least some of the executive pilots had given false evidence in respect of their knowledge of low flying. Nevertheless, after the conclusion of the evidence, it became apparent that official tolerance of low flying was in no way causative of the accident. But when the executive pilots were giving evidence, the causes of the crash still remained undetermined. And it is an understandable weakness
on the part of individual members of the airline management that they should shrink from acknowledging, even to themselves, that something that they had done or failed to do might have been a cause of so horrendous a disaster. Nope. I've read it 3 times, and for the life of me, I still cannot understand what he is saying.
The man is simply saying, 1, that my analysis of the cause of the accident is brilliant and correct. 2, that my analysis of the cause of the accident is incorrect, insofar as I give any weight to executive knowledge of low flying. 3, that the executives might well have been lying about their knowledge of low flying. 4, that doesn't matter, because their lordships don't think that had anything to do with the cause of the disaster. 5, that because at the time they lied, the executives thought low flying was a possible cause of the disaster, it was quite understandable for them to want to lie.
Oh, Peter. What can we do?
Where the instrument of thinking mind is joined to strength and to malice, man's defense cannot avail to meet those powers combined.
Mann has offered part-time work at the University of Auckland. It is the beginning of a new post-Erebus life in an environment Mann enjoys.
Thank you, Gary. Dear Lloyd, I received your note declining my invitation to lunch. I regret that you consider a luncheon with me to be incompatible to your continuing representation of your client company's best interests. You will, of course, appreciate that in adopting the course I did, I was obliged to keep uppermost in my mind not the best interests of your client company, nor the best interests of the Department of Civil Aviation, nor the government, nor indeed the interests of the Airline Pilots Association, or the consortium, or any of the other interests tangibly represented at the hearings. Uppermost in my mind at all times was my obligation to represent the interests of 257 men and women who perished in a disaster which might have been avoided. If my actions in that respect have embarrassed you and compromised our friendship, it is clear to me now that the value I always attributed to that friendship was false. Morning, lads.
Your Honour.
How's tricks?
Bowling along, Your Honour. You're looking extra curly yourself.
You're a better judge of horses, Lance.
I hope the weights aren't getting to you.
Aged stare. Almost weighted out by the handicapper, Lance.
You know the true stayers, Your Honour. They only come through with a bit of age.
I should have taken up your offer, Lance. Spotting nags for the tipster's rag. I'd have enjoyed that. Up at dawn with the dew and the mist, the stopwatch in hand, the thump of hooves on wet grass, the snort of a clean-winded colt. I think sometimes it's been a bit of a waste.
On the 11th of August, 1986, Peter Mann died of heart failure.
For my purposes, the most definitive illustration of the hidden perils of the Antarctic was the wreckage which lay on the mountainside below me, showing how the forces of nature, if given the chance, can sometimes defeat the flawless technology of man. For the ultimate key to the tragedy lay here, in the white silence of Erebus, the place to which the airliner had been unerringly guided by its micro-electronic navigation system, only to be destroyed in clear air and without warning by a malevolent trick of the polar light.